90% of all knitters struggle with the same handful of problems, but almost nobody talks about the real solutions. So in this video, we are tackling the 5 most frustrating knitting issues of all time. And I will show you easy solutions so your projects look cleaner, neater, and more professional. The number one question I receive here on my channel revolves around bind-offs. So no matter if I show a long tail cast on, a single cast on, a knitted cast on, a German twisted cast on, or a double knitting cast on, there is always a huge demand for a bind-off that mirrors the edges these cast-ons create. And if you ask me, you only have 3 options. So here is how to create the perfect match for your standard long tail cast on. So leave a sizable tail and then thread the tail on a tapestry needle, and then you need to go into the second stitch on your knitting needle here and pull all the way through. Pull tight or moderately tight. And now you are going to go into the first stitch on your knitting needle purlwise, here purlwise, and drop that stitch at the same time. And then you repeat. So you go into the second stitch here knitwise and pull the yarn through. And then you drop the first stitch purlwise. Pull tight, and you just repeat those 2 actions. Make sure that you don't pull too tight, because that is going to take away all the stretchiness, but just like so, and it goes relatively fast. Knitwise into the second stitch, purlwise, and drop for the first stitch. And there you have it. So see these slanting lines here with the little purl stitch on top. If we turn things around, here we have our long tail cast on, slanting lines, purl stitch on top. June Hammond Heights calls this bind-off the half-hitch bind-off, probably because she calls the standard long tail cast on half-hitch cast on. Since you do need to leave a long tail, you could also call this sewn long tail bind-off. Pick whatever name you like, but it creates the perfect match. If you want to create the perfect match for the standard bind-off, then you need a crochet hook, and you start with a simple slip knot around your crochet hook, and then you pick your knitting needle and place it here in between work and crochet hook, and then you simply chain 1 stitch, and from here you bring the working yarn to the back, yarn over, pull through. Bring the yarn to the back, yarn over, pull through. So even if you don't know how to crochet, this should be fairly simple. You just chain stitches and bring the yarn to the back. This technique can be used to create a provisional cast on, but you can also use it as so, and then you create this beautiful chain stitch edge. So see where your standard bind-off will create the exact same edge. And fun fact, instead of your knitting needles, you can also do the standard bind-off using your crochet hook. I already showed you this in a previous video, but it's totally doable. And it will create the exact same edge here. Isn't that wonderful? For all other bind-offs, I'm afraid there are no perfect matches, but here is a very smart trick. So you start your project with a provisional cast on. And then you bind off any which way. So here I am using a stretchy bind off where I knit all stitches here together through the back loop instead of passing over. But again, you can bind off any which way, it doesn't matter. And then you turn your project around, slide these stitches back to your knitting needle or pick them up, and then you can use the exact same bind off method and bind off this edge in the exact same way, and naturally it will also look the same as a result. And here, this is the result. So I get the exact same edge on both sides. It's a little bit more complicated, but I feel a viable method if you care about these details. You also have a third option. You can simply embrace the fact that almost all knitting projects are not fully reversible and they are not bidirectional. Take this cowl, for example. Most casual observers simply wouldn't focus on the fact that this bind-off edge looks slightly different than this cast-on edge. I mean, realistically speaking, they're almost never seen side by side. Focus on your stitch definition. Focus on the overall neatness of your project. But don't try to fight the fact that if you turn an increase upside down, it will never look like a decrease. And the same applies to cast-ons and bind-offs. If you try to fight it often, you need to make a compromise. And typically, that does not necessarily lead to better results. The next area where so many knitters have problems all revolves around ribbing. So 1x1 ribbing often looks a little bit, well, butchered, I guess. And then 2x2 ribbing, the second knit column always or often looks a little bit wider. The stitches are just noticeable bigger than the adjacent knit stitches. And here is what you can do against this. First of all, always consider knitting ribbing with relatively small knitting needles. So here, this is 1x1 ribbing in a rustic yarn, and it looks a little bit too much on the charmingly homemade side. Now here, this swatch has the exact same number of ribs. It's the exact same yarn, but it is knitted with smaller knitting needles, and it already looks a lot better, don't you think? Secondly, make it a habit to always tighten up the first purl stitch of a purl rib. So here, this is the first purl stitch. And while that is still on the knitting needles, I tighten things up here. This is the important bit. And then you continue purling and working across until you come to the next first purl stitch. Tighten up and continue. So why would this help? Well, here's the thing. I'm obviously exaggerating now, but when you switch from a knit to a purl stitch as a continental knitter, the yarn between those two stitches exits this knit stitch through the back, then goes here towards the front to enter the purl stitch from the front. So it goes all this way. When, on the other hand, you are switching from a purl stitch to a knit stitch, here, this is the strand between these two stitches. It exits this purl stitch through the front and enters the adjacent knit stitch through the back. So it can take the diagonal. This is much shorter, and you can see this very clearly, how here this strand here always needs to go the extra mile all the way around, whereas here it's just taking the diagonal. And this is why it's so important to tighten the purl stitch, this first purl stitch up while it's still on the knitting needles, because watch what happens here. Can you see how this strand here, one more time, how this strand here gets reduced. And this will make your knitting and your 1x1 ribbing so much neater. Because if you don't, this slightly longer strand here, so there's more slack here in the fabric, and this can feed into this knit stitch automatically, and this is why this column looks a little bit looser, whereas this is tighter. And this is precisely the reason why a lot of combination knitters say, well, this isn't even an issue for me. So I wrap the yarn around the knitting needle counterclockwise. Combination knitters purl like so. So they wrap the yarn around the needle clockwise, and simultaneously they change the mount of these stitches. So the leading leg ends up being in the back. But of course, this small little action also changes the distance this little strand here needs to travel as it transitions from the knit to the purl stitch, and ultimately it can make your ribbing look neater. In a similar vein, some people purl all these purl stitches here through the back loop. So they don't purl them the regular way, but they purl them through the back loop. But again, this twists the stitch one row below, and it ensures that this strand here is a little bit shorter. On top of that, when you compare a normal knit stitch, which is just a loop, to a twisted stitch, which is obviously twisted, this loop, because you are twisting around once, will be small. I mean, I could twist around even further, and then this loop would be very, very small. We're not doing this. But half that twist also makes every purl stitch smaller. So as a result, whenever you purl all these purl stitches here through the back loop, you are reducing the size of these purl stitches, making them tighter, making them crisper, and you optimize the transition between these stitches. And for some, this can lead to great effects. Obviously, you just knit the knit stitches the regular way. And obviously, whenever you are working flat, this would mean on the wrong side, you have to knit all the knit stitches through the back loop and purl the purl stitches the regular way. So you just address one side, so to speak, of the ribbing. Another trick I often employ is changing the ribbing. So I knit a little swatch, and when I notice, okay, this 1x1 ribbing looks super weird, then I go down a needle size and check, well, does this already help? And when I'm still not satisfied with that, then I might switch to a different kind of ribbing. So in this case here, I went for 2x1 ribbing, but you could also do 3x2 ribbing. And often this looks quite a little bit neater while still being stretchy enough. So for a lot of cuffs or hems or so, I often will go for a 2x1 or a 3x2 ribbing, because I just feel most 1x1 ribbings look a little bit weird. And lastly, please pick your yarn wisely. So there is a reason why this swatch here looks so much neater, because it's a slick yarn that is consistently spun and it has a medium twist. This means I can tighten up these stitches here consistently. When I block things, things will even out. Whereas here, for this swatch, we have an inconsistently spun natural sheep wool yarn with a lot of friction. This means because there's just so much friction, you can't even tighten up the stitches correctly as you knit, and then as you block things still won't work correctly, and then it's a little bit too lofty, and all these factors put together create ribbing that typically looks a little bit more on the wonky side. So please know that probably 80% of knitting needle ribbing revolves around picking a yarn that is suitable for knitting ribbing. But I would like to remind you that this issue is just like the one with the cast-ons and the matching bind-offs. At a certain point, you absolutely need to accept that this is how knitting, this is how ribbing works. Stitches are always shaped by the stitches surrounding them. I mean, you really need to understand that purling a stitch does not create a bump. Purling a stitch turns the upper part of the loop one row below into a bump. And if you knit 2x2 ribbing, it's entirely normal that the left stitch of the column is a little bit bigger. And that is entirely okay. Again, focus on consistency, but don't focus on changing the way knitting actually works. A lot of people complain about purling. They hate it. They hate it so much that you can go on social media and you will find entire threads filled with people trying to convince other people that they just need to switch to this one other knitting style, and supposedly this will make purling so much easier. Right here, I want to focus on showing you why purling is more difficult than knitting, and that it is entirely okay to feel, okay, this feels a little bit more cumbersome. And of course, I'm also going to show you a couple of solutions to make purling a little bit easier for you. So, our knitting needles famously don't have a hook at their ends. We need to scoop up the yarn with a tapered end. And this means, for logical reasons, your tip needs to be fully behind the yarn. If it's not fully behind and you try to scoop things up, the yarn will always slip off. But here, as soon as I'm fully behind, this is where I can scoop things up without it sliding off the tip again. And this explains why the continental knit stitch is so easy. So you enter from left to right, and then you can easily get behind the yarn to scoop it through. Experienced continental knitter will just pick it through. And everything, the whole way you tension your yarn, works in your favor, and you can easily pick things through. The whole issue with a purl stitch is, as you enter that stitch, it's very, very difficult to actually get behind the yarn. So you need to do some intense maneuvering to get behind the yarn. Theoretically speaking, you would have to change the way you tension your yarn, because for a purl stitch, you bring the yarn from the back to the front. Instead of entering from left to right, you enter from right to left. And as a result, you also would have to change the way you tension your yarn. And if you do that, suddenly it's a lot easier to scoop the yarn through. Now, I don't actually recommend purling like this. This was just meant to prove that if you want to learn how to purl a little bit easier, you need to change the way you tension your yarn. So if you have been following me here on my channel, you already know that I do this by pushing the yarn forward with my middle finger. Enter, push forward, or rather, it's almost like a wrapping motion, pull through. Some people do this with their thumbs. So you can also do it like so. I find this a little bit cumbersome, but maybe it works for you. That is the very reason why some people tension the yarn around their index finger, because then here they can push their index finger forward as well. So this would be another alternative way to easily change the angle. Of course, it always helps if you move both needles and not just one. So, because if you try to scoop the yarn up like so, you need to go to extreme lengths. However, if you meet in the middle, it's a little bit easier. And I guess this is the very reason why combination knitting is so popular, because with continental knitting you need to wrap around counterclockwise, and this means you need to do all this awkward angling around because you somehow need to get behind. In combination knitting you wrap around clockwise, so you can actually scoop the yarn through the way you would scoop through here a knit stitch. So as you can see, it's the exact same technique, but important, you change the amount of these stitches because suddenly the leading leg, can you see this? The leading leg is in the back. For a normal knit stitch, the leading leg would be in front. Combination knitters fix this by knitting here all these purl stitches through the back loop here, and this fixes their mount again. So now everything is correct, and as you can see, knitting a stitch through the back loop, especially with a stitch as wide open here to my knitting needle as this twisted stitch, is super easy. I can still grab the yarn through at a very comfortable angle. A possibly ingenious way to circumvent this whole issue goes like this. So you enter as normal, but now you wrap around, do a full wrap, and then you use your thumb here to scoop things through. One more time. Wrap around, do a full wrap, scoop things through, but don't worry about the full wrap, because as you pull things through, the full wrap partially unravels. One more time. Go like this, go through. There is a variation of this technique called the Norwegian purl, where you keep the yarn in the back, but here your right knitting needle, the important right knitting needle, stays still behind it, so actually it's still in front. And then you go like so. So here you create this full wrap, and then you guide it through like so. In the back, but in front of the right needle, like so. So with these two methods, Norwegian purl and the double wrap, you are basically creating a little barrier that prevents things from slipping off, and this double wrap, of course, helps as well. So as you can see, there are many ways to circumvent or combat these tensioning issues. Some people will teach themselves how to backward knit, so they never have to purl a single stitch. I have a full video on backwards knitting. I link it to you up in here. However, I would like to caution you. So backwards knitting only works when you have to purl across a full row, so entrelac or bubble stitch, perfect for it. But as soon as you need to knit ribbing, it doesn't really help you anymore, except you fully commit to teaching yourself left-handed knitting as well. And I would guess that for most people it's better to invest that time into perfecting their purl technique and practice a little bit. But at the end of the day, as I said, you just need to accept that for logical reasons, a purl stitch has to be more difficult than a knit stitch. Everything is exactly the opposite way. You are trying to achieve a knit stitch from the wrong side, but you tension the yarn in the same way. And the second you change that is when purling becomes a little bit easier. And when you practice. Half of the beginners I know knitted a scarf and stockinette stitch at one point. Now any experienced knitter will be able to tell you that this is probably a bad idea, while the inexperienced knitters will scramble to find a way to prevent this annoying curling on all sides. Now the curling is a combination of the tension in the fabric and a structural weakness of the fabric. Let's take a look. The easiest way to explain why stockinette stitch curls goes like this. So here we have a swatch and stockinette stitch, and there's a single line of purl stitches in between. and this acts as an easy fold line you can use to knit double hems, cuffs or collars. Why is that? Well, you have all these purl bumps here, and they sort of act as a barrier. Here on the other side, here where these two knit stitches meet, this creates a hinge. But because you have this barrier of purl stitches that protrude here, the fabric wants to fold in this direction. It's a hinge, and it's just easier because all these purl bumps act as a barrier. Now, if we take a look at this swatch here in stockinette stitch and at the wrong side, basically you have rows and rows and rows of these barriers, and here every connection between two stitches is a hinge. And because there's always tension in your fabric, this here you can stretch it, it will bounce back. There's tension in the fabric wants to be relaxed, so it takes the easiest path, and the easiest path is in this direction because the purl bumps act as a buffer. There is only a single way to prevent this. You need to knit with larger needles, because the larger your needles are, the more space there is between the stitches. So this here is pure stockinette stitch. Might not look like it, but it is. Can you see here is a V, here is a V. See this nice column of V's, and here this would be the reverse side. The reason why this doesn't curl has to do with the fact that there's all this space between the stitches. So even though here I have nice fold lines, there's just not enough tension in the fabric for it to matter. Now I can only speak for myself, but typically I don't want my sweaters to be only holes and air. That's why we add a border to stockinette stitch to supposedly prevent it from curling. Now I want you to understand that no matter which border you pick, it won't prevent stockinette stitch from curling. So take a look here at this fabric. It still curls, it still curls. The ribbing doesn't, because it's an even mix of knit and purl stitches, but this part curls. And if the tension in the fabric is too high and this little border is too short, all these fold lines we discussed earlier, all these fold lines come into action, and then this will happen. Your precious border will actually flip over, and arguably things will look even worse than before. So here is the truly important bit. When you add any sort of border, make sure it's long enough, because if it's long enough, then it's heavy enough to drag things down regardless. So this here wants to curl. Okay, but if this is heavy enough, it will drag it down. So the border acts as a counter force, as a counterweight to the tension in your fabric. And just in case, if you don't want this weird little bump or transition here as you switch from stockinette stitch to ribbing, then consider slipping those purl stitches in the row prior to your change, and then the result will be a much smoother transition without this little bump. At the end of the day, again, please embrace the fact that stockinette stitch, when you knit it flat, curls. It is called stockinette stitch for a reason, because it's the perfect pattern for stockings, for socks. But with such a tubular object, there simply are no edges that can curl in. So the curling is no issue. But as soon as you knit it flat, that's where the issues start. And for flat knitting, ribbing, seed stitch, moss stitch, all these knit purl combinations are just perfect. Use stockinette stitch mainly for knitting in the round. I don't know if you know this feeling. So you are happily knitting along, but then you take a look at your knitting and suddenly you notice that the left edge of your project is so much looser than the right edge. Why is that? And how can you fix it? Here's the short answer. You cannot. But we'll take a look at the long answer nevertheless. Now here is the big issue. Normally the size of your stitches is defined by the barrel of your knitting needle. See how all these loops are firmly wrapped around your knitting needles and there is not a lot of space below. Now as you knit a stitch, you suddenly need to force 2 knitting needles into a loop where previously only one was. Now I want you to focus on this loop here. And as I knit the next stitch here, see how this action, the act of forcing 2 knitting needles into one stitch, steals yarn, see, from the preceding stitch. And here's the thing. This makes the stitch 1 row below bigger, but as I knit the next stitch, I steal all that extra slack right back into the next stitch. So with every stitch that I knit, I transport this little bit of extra slack, this little bit of extra yarn over to the next stitch I transport it forward. But then here, as I knit the last stitch of my row, I dump all this extra slack into the last stitch. Now watch very, very closely. I turn my work around and then I might knit or slip that first stitch. It doesn't matter, because no matter how tight I pull on that stitch, I'm not going to affect this stitch anymore. This is because this stitch and this stitch are not directly connected anymore. See here, this loop here is connected to this stitch, and no matter how tight I pull on that stitch, I won't close this stitch. So this might explain why this side here is quite a bit looser. But you might go, well, okay, Norman, but why isn't this side loose as well? Well, this will depend entirely on you and your knitting technique. But take a look at my example. As I purl my stitches, I actually go into the little gap here below the stitches, so I barely extend these stitches beyond their usual limit. And then as I knit stitches, let's analyze that. As I knit stitches, I typically extend the stitch a little bit to the side. So I'm not just squeezing in through here, I extend it to the side. So I am transporting a lot more slack into that and dump it into that stitch. So this will entirely depend on you and your technique. If you want to avoid this, you basically need to change your whole knitting technique, which typically is a little bit difficult. But here, for those last 3 stitches or 4 stitches of a row, try to make a conscious effort to not stretch out these stitches overly much. And maybe to counterbalance things, this entirely depends on the edges you create. Here, for these last 3 stitches of a row, try to consciously extend these stitches a bit more than you usually would. And in that way, you will tighten up this edge a little bit and loosen up this edge a little bit, and hopefully things will be balanced as a result. Now, another thing that will take a conscious effort is when you are knitting lace shawls. Often the edge is actually not stretchy enough, and here is what I do. So I could loosen up this stitch, but then as I knit this stitch and maybe tighten up a little bit, I can close down this stitch here again. So in reality, this served no purpose. Rather, I do it like so. So I slip 1 stitch, knit 1 stitch, or whatever the pattern says, and then I extend these 2 stitches. And now there's enough friction on the knitting needle that if I pull, no matter how tight I pull on the working yarn, this stitch here stays big. And I do the exact same thing over on the other side. So I work the first 2 stitches and then I pull out before I continue working across. And this simple little action will ensure that both my edges here, let's do it one last time, that both my edges are stretchy enough. But at the end of the day, at one point you need to embrace the fact that your edges will always look slightly different. It's just an extension of your personal knitting style. And if you want to fix that, you would have to dramatically change your knitting style. And there's a high chance that this will actually lead to yet different problems and not actually fix this problem. So you kind of need to embrace it and focus on the stitch definition, on keeping things consistent. That is where the magic happens. Again, not when you try to force things that are just not meant to happen. Anyway, that was my explanation for some of the most common knitting problems and how you can, or rather should, approach solving them. Now, do you have a similar issue that bugs you to no end? Comment below and maybe together we can find an easy solution. And as always, happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day. Oh, and don't forget to like and subscribe.